Good morning, everybody. If you're new here for the first time or visiting us from out of town, we're in the midst of a series, a 6-week series. Today's the second part of the series, and it's entitled The Art of Living Together. Last week, Sandra Campbell spoke about relationships as well, and she made 3 points which I thought were outstanding. If you haven't had a chance to look at the talk, you can do so on YouTube or the Unity Temple website. But the 3 points which are most important in relationships, first and foremost, relationships are everything. Everything about your existence, everything about your life, everything about you, all involves a relationship of some sort. There's nothing outside the realm of relationships. We are born to relate from the earliest stages of our existence, to relate to something or somebody that is outside of us. Relationships are everything. Now, the second thing is that relationships don't come into our lives and go out of our lives. And relationships come into our lives and they remain in our lives because it's an internal dynamic. The relationship that you have with anybody or anything is within you. And it is represented by your thoughts, feelings, attitudes, and perceptions in regards to that which you're relating to, whether it's another person, a place, or a thing. So relationships are forever, and the condition or the health of the relationship is identical to the condition or the health of your entire life. If you take all your relationships together, the condition of all the relationships is exactly the same as the condition of your life, whether that's good, bad, happy, sad. And the point is, if there's something that you're not happy with in your life, if there's something that is disturbing you, if you don't feel well about yourself, if you're not connected to your higher power, whatever it might be, and it's simplified for us because it is represented by a relationship. That dislike, that discomfort has to do with a relationship of some sort. And in most cases, it has to do with the relationship you have with yourself. Last week, Sandra talked about how important it is for self-love or self-acceptance or self-worth to just be comfortable in the body that you have, to make yourself at home in the world in which you live, and just to be okay with who you are. The only reason you shouldn't be okay with who you are is if you have a delusion of some sort of inadequacy, and that is not true for any of us. So relationships are everything. Relationships last forever. Now, if it's a relationship that just develops in passing, say you're going down the street and you say hi to somebody, and that relationship still continues to exist within you, it's just that it's not on instant recall. If you happen to run into the person again sometime down the road, it would probably spark that memory and you would recall the relationship. If you have a relationship that went sour along the way, say a divorce or a friendship that broke up or even a death of some sort, that relationship is still within you, and the condition of that relationship still affects you in some way. So what I'm saying is, if you have a relationship that does not feel good, that does not support you, that is not in your best interest, and there is a way to heal that so that you don't have to live with that disruptive relationship going forward. Now, every relationship has what we call a wellness factor, and that's the focus of the lesson today. A wellness factor is primarily about you. It's when you move into a relationship and you start to communicate with somebody, or you start to engage or interact with another person, what type of wellness comes about as a result of your expression. If I move into a relationship with any one of you and we start to relate to each other and communicate with each other, do you feel better because of me? Or do you feel worse because of me? Am I good for you? Or am I not good for you? We all know people that are in our lives, and when we engage in some sort of a communication with them, they just don't make us feel good. They have perhaps a belligerence or an outspokenness or something that just pushes our buttons. And it doesn't necessarily have to be them, but it does something to us. So there's a wellness factor. Every relationship you have, you affect the wellness of that relationship, not only in the world outside you, but in the internal world. As an example, a college roommate visited a woman here in Kansas City, and the woman thought that she would show her the wonderful, beautiful plaza, so they took a stroll. And as they were walking down the sidewalk, here was a homeless person, a beggar, shaking his cup for money. Well, the woman that lived here in Kansas City was extremely embarrassed by this. She didn't think the Country Club Plaza should be littered by people of such. And so she kind of shuffled her friend around the person who was asking for money and gave him a very scornful look as she passed by. Later that day, a businessman was on his way to an important meeting under a lot of stress, and he is in a hurry. He passed the same person on the street shaking his cup for money. And he just slowed his pace down for a moment and looked at him and says, "Why don't you get a job like everybody else and quit freeloading on us?" in a very harsh way as he stormed by. Once again, later that day, a third person came by, an elderly lady, and as she passed the beggar shaking his cup for money, she stopped for just a moment and held up her hand as if to say, "I'm sorry, I have nothing to give today." But she did say to him in passing, with a smile on her face, "I wish you well." Very simple. Now, all three of these people had pretty much the same experience. None of them gave the beggar money. None of them spent more than 15 seconds interacting. But I want you to just stop and recall the difference that was made. One woman, the elderly woman, put good into the world. She made the street person feel good, I'm sure, by recognizing him and wishing him well. She felt good because of her acceptance of him, and everything was fine, all within a 15-second span. But with the other two, there was hurt that was put into the world. The first, that woman that went by shamed the person that was asking for money. She had no idea what his condition was. She had no idea what his history was. She had no idea what he's going through in his life other than the fact that he might be hungry. But nevertheless, she spewed out rejection and a certain amount of dissatisfaction with the person, and that's what stuck. As she continued, she carried with her that emotion, and the street person was left with an emotion that made him feel not good about himself. The same thing with the businessman who spoke harshly to him. What did he put into the world? He put into the world hate. He put into the world rejection. The wellness factor for both of the first two people is a fail. They did not get it. At that moment, the world was not a better place because of them. For the third person, the elderly lady, it was. Now, the purpose for us being here, and I think everybody will agree with this, the purpose for us being here very simply is to have the world be a better place because of us, individually, on our own. Every night when you go to bed, that should be the last question and that you recall before you go to sleep. Was the world a better place because of me? Or was it a worse place because of me? That's the wellness factor. What kind of wellness do you bring to the world? Or do you bring to the world a sort of unwellness or ill feeling that is created by your words and your actions? Now, getting down for each and every one of us to the personal relationships that we have, we like to be in harmony. It's much, much easier for me to have a good relationship with you and be in harmony with you and communicate with you in a wonderful, friendly way when you're out there and I'm up here. But any one of you in this room, if we ended up living together for 30 days, you'd have a totally different opinion of me. And I might have a different opinion of you. But the closer you get to somebody, the more our guard comes down, the more vulnerable we let ourselves be, and the more upset other people can become with us or we can become with them. Now, the biggest thing in disrupting a personal relationship is an assumption. Now, I say assumption because that is the first of 4 steps. Assumption. We assume that people are going to do what we want them to do. We assume that people are going to think like we think. We assume that people are going to have the same sort of action-reaction that we have towards something. We just assume that people are going to be like that. And when they aren't, then we get upset. But when we move into the closer relationships, those relationships that we see on a regular basis, whether it's a good friend, a family member, or whatever, we move into that closer relationship, we move from assumption into expectation. I expect you to do that. And the ramifications of that are much, much greater than the ramifications of an assumption. I assume that you'll be home on time for dinner. You don't get home, it's not that big of a deal. If I expect you to be home on time for dinner, and I hold off eating, and the longer it goes, the more irritated I get, that expectation is ill-founded because it's something that you did not agree on. So we have assumptions. I assume that you will be a good audience today and not jeer me or crumple up your bulletins and throw them at me. That happened once in my entire career. And the person was absolutely right. If I was him, I would have done the same thing to me. I said something that was, it didn't make any difference at this point. let's just continue forward. So we have assumption and expectation. I expect you to do something or to be a certain way or to think a certain way or to feel a certain way. I just assume that and I expect that. And when my expectations aren't met, what comes next? Disappointment. Sometimes even disturbance. How could you do that when you knew that I would want you to do this? So a very simple solution for assumptions and expectations is agreements. For every couple that's been married, and they make an agreement at the altar to certain vows, whatever that might be. Some people custom design them so that they have agreements in place that they'll both follow. When we go about our regular business, we have agreements with each other, whether it's somebody in the workplace, somebody in the home, somebody here at church. We have certain agreements that we are going to abide by the laws of this state and this country. We have certain agreements that we're going to try to act in a morally high way, and we can expect that to happen because those are the rules or the laws of our society, correct? We can expect that to happen. But what if somebody does something that is not against the law and it's not immoral, but it irritates us nevertheless? Unless we have an agreement with that person not to do that, then we don't have the right to an expectation. I want you to think about that for a moment. An expectation is only justified when it falls within the boundary of the law, falls within the boundaries of high moral action, or there's been an agreement with two people or two groups of people to refrain from that kind of action or behavior, thoughts, feelings, words, or behavior. Do you understand what I'm saying? When we set an expectation without an agreement for another person, we're setting ourselves up for disappointment. Sometimes they might follow through and fulfill our expectations, sometimes they might not, but nevertheless, that's where arguments start. Expectations that we have towards other people to be like ourselves, to be the way we want them to be, to think the way we want them to think, to feel the way they want them to feel. We just expect that. Recently, I went home to my 50th high school reunion. And we had about 235 people there. These are all kids that I grew up with and graduated from high school with. Well, I hadn't seen many of them for 50 years, and so it was a wonderful occasion getting together and greeting everybody. But when we broke down into smaller groups, and this particular group that I was in was about 18, we all went up to one of the person's hotel rooms. And when we sat down there for more intimate conversation, it became apparent to me that I was the only one in the room who was of one particular political persuasion, and everybody else was of a different political persuasion. Some of you are kind of getting Cindy, you look confused. They were all for Trump. That's just the way it was. And I expected it to not be that way, but that's what South Dakota is. It's a strong Republican, conservative state. So I'm in this room with 17 people, and they all start talking about politics, and then, oh, God forbid, they turn to religion. And, and most of them were fundamentalists or very traditional religious people. And so I spent most of the evening in that group of 18 people, many of whom were good friends during high school, just being quiet. There's nothing I could say and maintain my integrity. Now, going into that, I had an expectation for them to be more like me, to think more like me, and when they weren't, I was disappointed and I was a bit disturbed. But what right did I have for that expectation? The right that I felt that I was in a group with intelligent people? That was wrong. Shut the camera down. I am just digging myself a hole here. I hope you get my example. It is relationships are everything. Every single relationship has a condition to it that determines how you feel going forward. It comes into this world and it stays with you. It grows within you. It's like a spiritual child that is alive. And relationships, in addition to lasting forever, are the primary criteria for how we feel about ourselves and our world. When I move to agreements, it is very, very simple. If you're living with somebody, you have a best friend, you have a person in the workplace that is constantly pushing your buttons, that is constantly irritating you in some way, that is doing things that are snide little remarks that kind of cut you down, but they think it's funny. If that's the case, you don't have a right to expect them not to do that unless you sit down with them and say, let's make an agreement that you won't do this anymore and I won't do this, whatever it might be. We're going to continue with this series over the next 4 more weeks. And I want to assure you by the end, we're going to have principles like we discussed today that allow you to rise above any sort of rejection or angst or disturbance that you have in the relationships, and also determine in relationships, where do you want to be present? Who do you want to be present with? And as we talked about a couple of weeks ago, we want to be surrounded by people that support us, by people that are good for us, that are good to us, that people make us feel alive and motivated to continue to move on our spiritual path. We like those people. The people that cut us down, don't treat us fairly, don't respect us, they're still real people. All we have to do is just remove ourselves and create a little bit of distance so that they don't have an influence over us. They can't influence us into anger. They can't influence us into hurt. They can't influence us into behaving like them and moving into some sort of a conflict or an argument. So as we move into meditation, I want you to stop and think if there's anything in your life at this point that is kind of like a cavity in a tooth or a sore in your finger, something that is just there and it hurts at times when you think about it. It's time for that to be healed. And we're going to do that, whether it be today or in the lessons to come. So we now move into meditation.